Chapters 1 through 9 of the second book of the Chronicles. Chapter 1. Solomon the son of David was fixed in his kingship, and the ever-living his God was with him, and exalted him greatly. Solomon consequently convoked all Israel, with the officers of the army and magistracy, and all the princes, and all the chiefs of ancestral houses, who went with Solomon and the parliament of his people to the mound that was in Gibeon, where the hall of assembly of God was, which Moses the servant of the ever-living had made in the desert. David, however, had brought the ark of God from Kiriath-jearim to David's structure for it, for he had pitched a tent for it at Jerusalem. The brazen altar, however, which Bezalel ben Uri ben Hur had made, was there before the tabernacle of the ever-living, so Solomon and the parliament went down to it. And Solomon offered sacrifice before the ever-living upon the brazen altar, which was in the hall of assembly, and offered as his sacrifice 1,000 burnt offerings. In that night God appeared to Solomon and said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon replied to God, "You showed great kindness to my father David, and have made me king after him. Therefore, ever-living God, confirm your promise to my father David, for you have made my empire over people as numerous as the dust of the earth. So give me wisdom and knowledge to conduct myself before these people. For who can govern this great people of yours?" When God answered Solomon, "Because this has been in your heart, and you have not asked wealth, treasures, and honor, nor the life of your enemies, nor have asked great length of days, but have asked wisdom and knowledge, by which you may govern my people, over whom I have given you the empire, wisdom and knowledge shall be given to you, and I will also give wealth, and treasures, and honor, such as have not been with the kings who were before you, and there shall not be such after you." Solomon then returned from the Mount of Gibeon to Jerusalem, from the hall of assembly, and reigned over Israel. Solomon then collected chariots and horsemen, and possessed 1,400 chariots, and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in chariot barracks, and with the king in Jerusalem. The king also made silver and gold in Jerusalem to be like stones, and planted cedars like sycamores that are on the slopes for number. But the horses that Solomon possessed were brought out of Mitzrayim. The drovers of the king collected them in droves, at fairs, and collected and brought out from Mitzrayim a chariot for 600 silvers, and a horse for 150, and the same from all the chiefs of the Hittites, and the chiefs of Edom. They were brought by their means. Chapter 2. Solomon also commanded to build the house of the ever-living, and a palace for his empire. Consequently, Solomon enrolled 70,000 men as laborers, and 80,000 men as woodsmen in the hills, with 3,600 as foremen over them. Solomon also sent to Huram, king of Sur, to say, "As you assisted my father David in sending cedars to him, when building himself a house to reside in, do with me in building a temple to the name of my ever-living God as a sanctuary for him, and to burn to him sweet-spiced incense with a continuous ritual, and for the morning and evening sacrifice, and for the Sabbaths and months, and for the festivals of our ever-living God, for this is to be forever in Israel. And the temple that I shall build will be large, for our God is greater than all gods. Yet who has ability to build him a house? For the heavens and the heavens of the heavens are not enough for him. So who am I who would build him a house, except to worship before him? Therefore now send me skillful men able to work in gold, and silver, and brass, and iron, and in purple, and crimson, and blue, and skilled in the carving of engravings, to work along with the mechanics who are with me in Judea and Jerusalem, whom my father David provided. Send me also cedar, fir, and algum timber from Lebanon, for I know that your subjects understand how to cut timber in Lebanon, and my subjects shall help yours. And prepare me plenty of timber, for the temple I am about to build will be large and wonderful. In return I will pay for the woodcutters who fell the timber, who are your subjects, 20,000 cores of ground wheat, and 20,000 cores of barley, with 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil. Huram king of Sur replied by letter and sent it to Solomon. Because the ever-living loves his people, he has made you king over them. And Huram continued, I bless the ever-living God of Israel, who made the heavens and the earth, because he has given a wise son to King David, educated in intellect and understanding, who will build a temple for the ever-living, and a house for his empire. I have therefore sent a man of genius, who was educated in construction by Huram my father. He is the son of a woman from the tribe of Dan, but his father was a native of Tsur. He understands to work in gold, silver, brass, iron, stone, and timber, in purple, in blue, in flax and crimson, and to carve engravings, and to contrive all kinds of enginery that may be required along with your mechanics and the mechanics of your father David. So now let my master send to his vassal the wheat, barley, oil, and wine that he says. Then we will cut the timber in Lebanon for all your requirements, and bring it to you in floats by sea to Jaffa, and you can take it up from there to Jerusalem. Solomon consequently collected all the foreigners who were in the land of Israel, according to the census which his father David conscribed, and found them to be 153,600. He made 70,000 of them laborers, and 80,000 woodcutters in the hills, with 3,600 overseers of the works of those people. Chapter 3. Thus Solomon began to build the house of the ever-living in Jerusalem, on the hill of the appearance of what appeared to his father David, which place was that of the granary of Arnon the Jebusite, which David bought. He began to build it in the 2nd month of the 4th year of his empire. And this was the foundation made by Solomon for the building of the house of God. The length in cubit measure was 60 cubits on the floor line, and the breadth 20. And the porch which was opposite the front at the entrance of the square court of the house was 20 cubits square, and its height was 120, and the outside was plated with pure gold. And he also lined the great temple with cypress wood, and plated it with fine gold, and depicted on it palm trees and creepers. He also adorned the house with handsome costly stones to beautify it, and the gold was parvim gold. Beside which he plated the temple, the approaches of the thresholds, and the walls and doors with gold, and carved cherubim on the walls. He also made the temple of the Holy of Holies. Its length was that of the breadth of the temple, 20 cubits, and it was plated with 600 talents of fine gold, with 50 shekels weight of gold for the nails. He also plated the steps with gold. He also had 2 cherubim made by sculptors in the temple of the Holy of Holies, and covered them with gold. The wings of the cherubim extended for 20 cubits, one wing for 5 cubits from the side of the wall of the house, and the other wing 5 cubits from the tip of the wing of the first cherub, and the wing of the first cherub of 5 cubits long touched the other wall of the house, and the wing of the second cherub of 5 cubits touched the wing of the first cherub. The wings of these cherubim spread 20 cubits, and they stood on their feet, but their faces were from the temple. He also made the veils of blue, and purple, and crimson, and linen, and depicted cherubim upon them. He also made 2 columns before the temple of 35 cubits high, with crowns on the top of them of 5 cubits. Then he made wreathing chains, and fixed them on the top of the columns, and prepared 100 pomegranates which were attached to the chains. He afterwards raised the columns in front of the temple, one on the right and the other on the left, and called the name of the right-hand one Firmness, Jachin, and of the other Activity, Boaz. Chapter 4. He also made an altar of brass, 20 cubits long, and 20 cubits broad, and 10 cubits high. He also made the sea by a casting of 10 cubits from lip to lip, circular in form, and 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits encircled it, with the likeness of bosses under it, circling all round. There were 10 in a cubit all round the sea. The bosses were in 2 rows, cast when it was cast. It stood upon 12 bullocks, 3 facing the north, and 3 facing the west, and 3 facing the south, and 3 facing the east. And the sea was upon them, and all their buttocks were inwards. It was a palm thick, and its lip was worked like the lip of a cup, as a lily flower. Its capacity was 3,000 baths complete. He also made 10 lavers, and placed 5 on the right and 5 on the left, in which to wash what was prepared for the sacrifices, by dipping them. But the priests washed in the sea itself. He made also the golden lamps, as they were decreed, and placed them in the temple, 5 on the right and 5 on the left. He also made 10 tables, and placed them in the temple, 5 on the right and 5 on the left, and made 100 basins of gold. He also constructed the priest's court, and the great enclosure, and the doors to the enclosure, and plated the doors with bronze. Then he placed the sea at the right corner, towards the southeast. Huram also made the boilers, and shovels, and basins. Thus Huram completed the whole of the work which he had to do for King Solomon at the house of God. The 2 columns, and the vases, and the diadems on the top of the 2 columns, and the 2 networks covering the 2 vases of the diadems which were on the top of the columns, and the 400 pomegranates interwoven row by row separately to cover the 2 vases which were on the heads of the columns, and the bases, and the lavers upon the bases, the single sea, and the 12 bullocks under it, with the boilers, and the shovels, and flesh hooks. Huram, along with his father, made all these appliances of bright brass for the house of the ever-living, for King Solomon. And he modeled them for the king in the stiff clay district of the Jordan, in the ground between Succoth and Zeradah. And Solomon made all these things in very great quantities, for he did not weigh out his brass. Solomon also made all the furniture of the house of the ever-living, and the golden altar, and the tables upon which the showbread was, with the lamps to be burnt as decreed before the pulpit of pure gold, with the cups and lamps and tongs of gold. It was perfect gold, and the snuffers and basins and spoons and firepans of pure gold, and the doors of the house, with their eaves at the inner doors of the Holy of Holies, and the doors of the structure of the temple of gold. Chapter 5. When all the work of Solomon at the house of the ever-living was finished, Solomon brought in the consecrations of his father David, both the silver and gold, and all the furniture he gave to the treasury of the house of God. And Solomon convoked for this purpose the magistrates of Israel, and all the chiefs of the tribes, and the ancestral princes of the children of Israel, to Jerusalem, to carry up the ark of the covenant of the ever-living from the city of David, which is Zion. The king also invited every person in Israel to the festival that occurs in the 7th month. All the magistracy of Israel consequently came, but the Levites carried the ark. The Levites also brought up the tent of assembly, and all the sacred furniture that was in the tent, the Levitical priests carrying them. Then King Solomon and all the representatives of Israel who were assembled with him before the ark sacrificed sheep and oxen without number, and not estimated for quantity. The priests then brought the ark of the covenant of the ever-living to its place at the pulpit of the house, to the Holy of Holies, under the canopy of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their wings over the place for the ark, so that cherubim covered the ark and its staves from above. But the staves projected, and the ends of the staves were seen from the ark at the front of the pulpit, but not seen beyond, and they were there permanently. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 slabs which Moses deposited at Horeb, when the ever-living made a covenant with the people of Israel on bringing them out from the Mitzrayim. When this was done, and all the priests came out from the sanctuary, for all the priests had been brought to the sanctuary, they were not separated, and the singing Levites, and Asaph, and Haman, and Jeduthun, and their sons and companions, clothed in linen, with cymbals, and lutes, and harps, stood by the altar with 120 priests sounding their trumpets, with the trumpeters and singers in unison, proclaimed with one voice praise and thanks to the ever-living. And when the sound of the trumpets and cymbals and all the instruments of song arose, with the "Praise the Lord for his goodness, for his mercy endures forever," the house was filled by a cloud, the house of the ever-living, so that the priests were not able to stand to serve on account of the cloud, for the glory of the ever-living filled the house of God. Chapter 6. Then Solomon exclaimed, "The Lord declared he would dwell in the gloom. Yet I have built a residence for you, and constructed a rest for you for ages." The king then turned his face and blessed all the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel stood up. And he said, "Thank the ever-living God of Israel, who promised with his mouth to my father David, and has accomplished it by his own hands, saying, 'From the day when I brought my people from the land of the Mitzrayim, I have not chosen a city from any of the tribes of Israel where a house should be built to my name. Nor have I chosen a person to be prince over my people Israel. But now I am choosing for my name to be in Jerusalem, and am choosing in David a superintendent over my people of Israel.' Then it came into the heart of my father David to build a house to the name of the ever-living God of Israel. But the ever-living said to David my father, 'Regarding what is in your heart about building a house to my name, you have done well that it was in your heart. However, you shall not build me a house, but a son of yours who comes from your loins shall build a house to my name.' The ever-living has now accomplished the promise that he promised, for I am raised after David, and sit upon the throne of Israel, as the ever-living promised. And I have built this house to the name of the ever-living God of Israel. I have also placed the ark there, in which is the covenant of the ever-living that he made with the children of Israel." Then he stood up before the altar of the ever-living, opposite all the parliament of Israel, and spread out his hands. For Solomon had made a platform of bronze, and fixed it in the center of the enclosure. It was 5 cubits long, and 5 cubits broad, and 3 cubits high. And he stood upon it and blessed with his blessing before all the parliament of Israel, and spread out his hands towards the heavens, and said, "Ever-living God of Israel, there is none like you, God in the heavens and on the earth. You keep the covenant, and have mercy for your servants who walk before you with a whole heart. You who have kept to your servant my father David what you promised to him, which you promised with your mouth, and have accomplished by your hands on this day. So now, ever-living God of Israel, keep to your servant my father David what you also promised to him, when saying, 'A man shall not be wanting to you in my presence to sit on the throne of Israel, if only your children guard their conduct to walk in my laws, as you have walked before me.' Therefore, ever-living God of Israel, let your promise that you promised to my father David be verified. But will God truly dwell with mankind upon earth? Look, the heavens and the heaven of the heavens cannot contain you. Then how can this house that I have built? Yet turn to the prayer of your servant, and to his entreaty, ever-living God, and listen to the cry and the prayer which your servant prays before you. Let your eyes be open to this house day and night, to the place where you have said you would place your name, and hear the prayer which your servant prays about this place, and listen to the entreaty of your servant and of your people of Israel, which they pray at this place, and let yourself hear from your dwelling place, from the heavens, and when you hear, forgive. If a person sins against his neighbor, and a curse is laid upon him to swear about it, and the curse is brought before your altar in this house, then hear from the heavens, and act, and decide about your servants, and return on the head of the wicked the results of his course, and to the righteous the results of his righteousness, when he has done right. And if your people of Israel are routed before their enemies, because they have sinned against you, when they turn and appeal to your name, and pray and entreat before you in this house, Then hear from the heavens, and forgive the sins of your people of Israel, and restore them to the country which you gave to them and their ancestors. When the skies are restrained, and rain comes not, because they sin against you, when they pray from this place, and appeal to your name, and turn from their sins, because you punish them, then hear from the heavens, and forgive the sins of your servants and of your people of Israel, and teach them the better way in which they should walk, and give rain upon your country, which you entrusted to your people to possess. When famine comes to the land, when plague comes, blasting or mildew, if locust or caterpillar should come, if its enemies besiege it in the gates of the country, or any contagion or any disease, any infliction, any distress, such as comes to all mankind, and to your people of Israel, which all men know in themselves, when in their sorrow they spread their hands to this house, then hear from the heavens the place of your rest, and forgive, and grant to the person whose heart you know what is right for his conduct. For you alone know the hearts of the sons of Adam, so that they may reverence you and walk in your ways all the days of their lives on the face of the land which you gave to our fathers. And also the foreigners, who are not sprung from your people of Israel, who came from distant countries for the sake of your great name, and your strong hand, and your directing arm, when they come and pray at this house, then listen from the heavens, from the abode of your rest, and do all that is asked of you by those foreigners, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and reverence you, like your people of Israel, and may learn that your name has been invoked upon this house that I have built. When your people go out to war with their enemies, on a path that you send them, and pray to you towards this city that you have built for it, and the house which I have built to your name, listen from the heavens to their prayer and entreaty, and do them justice when they sin against you. For there is no man who does not sin. And you are angry with them, and abandon them before their enemies, and their captors remove them to a distant land or a near one, when they turn their hearts in the land where they have been carried, and say, We have sinned and been willful and wicked, and they turn to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of captivity where they are captive, and pray towards the country which was given to their fathers, and the city that you have chosen, and the house which I have built to your name, then listen from the heavens, from the abode of your rest, to their prayers and entreaties, and do justice, and forgive your people who have sinned against you. Now, my God, let your eyes be open, and your ears listening to the prayers in this place. So now, ever-living God, establish your consolation, yourself, with the ark of your strength. Let your priests, ever-living God, be clothed in salvation, and your saints rejoice in beneficence. Ever-living God, turn not your face from your consecrated. Remember the good deeds of your servant David. Chapter 7. When Solomon had finished praying, the fire rushed down from the heavens and consumed the burnt offering and sacrifices. And the glory of the ever-living filled the house, so that the priests were not able to enter the house of the ever-living. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the ever-living. And all the children of Israel saw the down-rushing fire and the glory of the ever-living on the house. And they knelt face to the earth, on the pavement, and worshipped, and gave thanks to the ever-living, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. The king and the representatives of the people afterwards made a sacrifice before the ever-living. But King Solomon sacrificed a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. Thus the king and all the people dedicated the house of God, while the priests stood in their official robes, and the Levites, with the instruments of music which King David had made for the ever-living, to praise the Lord, for his mercy endures forever, as when David praised by their ministry. And the priests were near them with trumpets, and the representatives of Israel stood up. Solomon afterwards consecrated the middle court, which is before the house of the ever-living, for there he offered burnt offerings and the fats of the thank offerings, because the brazen altar that Solomon had made was notable to receive the burnt offerings, and the food offerings, and the fats. Solomon also made a festival at that time for 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great assembly, from the pass of Hamath to the canal of Mitzer. But in the 8th day they made a concluding feast, for they had made the dedication of the altar for 7 days, and the festival for 7 days. So on the 23rd day of the 7th month he dismissed the people to their homes, glad and pleased at heart at the prosperity that the ever-living had provided for David and Solomon, and for his people of Israel. Thus Solomon completed the house of the ever-living, and the palace of the king, with all that came to the mind of Solomon to do to the house of the ever-living, and to his own palace, he effected it. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon at night, and said to him, I have heard your prayers, and I have chosen this place for myself as a place of sacrifice. If I close the skies so that rain comes not, or if I order the locusts to devour the country, or if I send a plague upon my people, when my people, upon whom my name is invoked, kneel and pray and seek my presence, and turn from their wicked courses, then I will listen and forgive their sins, and will restore health to their land. Mine eyes will always be open, and my ears attentive to the prayers from this place, because I have chosen and have consecrated this house for my name to be there forever, and my heart there for all times. And yourself, if you walk before me as your father David walked, and do all that I have commanded you, and observe my institutions and decrees, then I will cause the throne of your empire to be established, as I undertook to your father David when I said, A man shall not be wanting to you to govern Israel. But if you turn from them and abandon them, and serve seducing gods and worship them, I will as a result be pulling you up out of the ground where I planted you, and from this house that I have consecrated to my name, I will fling you from my presence, and make a proverb and byword to all the nations, so that all who pass by it will be astonished at this house which was so high, and ask, Why has the ever-living done this to the land and to this temple? They will answer, Because they abandoned the ever-living God of their fathers, who brought them out of the country of the Mitzrayim, and have attached themselves to seducing gods and worshipped them. Therefore all this suffering has come upon them. Chapter 8. It occurred at the end of the 20 years in which Solomon built the temple of the ever-living, and his own palace, and the towns that Huram had sold to Solomon, where Solomon built and settled the children of Israel, that Solomon advanced against Hamath in the Zobah, and captured it. He also built Tadmor in the desert, and several colonial cities that he built about Hamath. He built as well Beth-horon the Lower, all fortified cities with walls, gates, and bars. And Baalath, and all the colonial cities that Solomon possessed, and all the barracks for chariots and cavalry, with all that Solomon devised to build for his amusement in Jerusalem, and in Lebanon, and in the whole of the country he governed. Solomon raised a conscription, which lasts to this day, from all the mass of the population who were not descended from Israel, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the descendants of those who remained in the country, whom the children of Israel had not destroyed. Solomon, however, did not make slaves of the children of Israel for his works, but they were soldiers, and officers, and commanders of his charioteers and horsemen. King Solomon's general officers were 250 who commanded the forces. Solomon, however, took the daughter of Pharaoh from the city of David to a house he had built for her, for he said, My wife shall not reside in the palace of David, king of Israel, for that, where the ark of the ever-living was brought, is sacred. Solomon was accustomed to offer burnt offerings to the ever-living on an altar to the Lord, which he had built before the porch regularly, day by day, with the burnt offerings as commanded by Moses, and on the Sabbaths and holy days, and at the assemblies 3 times in the year, at the feast of the unfermented bread, and at the feast of weeks, and the feast of tabernacles. And, as his father David had decreed, he set up the courses for the services of the priests, and the Levites and their officers, to give praise and sing in association with the priests regularly day by day, with the doorkeepers in courses from gate to gate, as David the man of God had commanded. He did not depart from the arrangements of that king about the priests and Levites in anything, or about the treasuries. Thus all the works of Solomon were finished about the temple of the ever-living, from the day of its foundation to the entire completion of the house of God. Solomon also went to Ezion-Gabar and Ailoth on the shore of the sea of the land of Edom. And Huram united with him by supplying the crews with his officers, ships, and sailors who understood the sea, who proceeded with the sailors of Solomon to Alphar, and brought from there 450 talents of gold, and delivered them to Solomon. Chapter 9. So the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, and came to Jerusalem to test him by problems, with a very great retinue, and camels loaded with spices, and a quantity of gold, and precious stones, which she brought to Solomon, and spoke with him about all she had in her mind. And Solomon informed her about all her inquiries, and she stated no difficulty that Solomon could not explain to her. But when the queen of Sheba perceived the wisdom of Solomon, and the palaces he had built, and the provision of his table, and the discipline of his servants, and the appointments of his ministers and their uniforms, his cupbearers and their dresses, and the stairs by which he went up to the house of the ever-living, there was no more spirit in her, and she exclaimed to the king, "It was a true report that I heard in my country about your achievements and wisdom, but I did not trust to their words until I came and my eyes saw it, and indeed they did not tell me half the extent of your acquirements. You surpass reports that I heard. These princes and your ministers are happy who always stand before you and hear your wisdom. Let your ever-living God be thanked, who has been pleased to place you on his throne, to govern for your ever-living God. Your God must have loved Israel, and would fix it to himself forever when he made you king over it, to execute justice and right." Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, and a quantity of spices and precious stones. There were never such spices as those which the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. The servants of Huram also, and the servants of Solomon, who brought gold from Alphar, brought algum wood and precious stones. From the algum wood the king made brackets in the temple of the ever-living, and the king's palace, and harps and lutes for the singers, for nothing of that kind had been seen before in the land of Judah. But King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, except what she had brought to the king. Then she departed, and she and her attendants returned to her own country. The weight of gold that came to Solomon each year was 666 talents of gold, beside what the merchants and commercial duties brought in, and the gold and silver that the kings of Arabia and the governors of provinces contributed to Solomon. King Solomon consequently made 300 targets of wrought gold. 600 of wrought gold went to one target, and 300 shields of wrought gold. 300 of gold went to one shield, and he put them in the palace of Lebanon. The king also made a great throne of ivory, and plated it with pure gold, and 6 steps to the throne, with a footstool of gold fastened to the throne, and arms on each side at the seat, with 2 lions standing at the side of the arms. 12 lions also stood there on the 6 steps, one on each side. None such were ever made in any kingdoms. And all King Solomon's drinking cups were of gold, and all the furniture of the forest palace of Lebanon were of fine gold. Silver and brass were thought nothing of in the days of Solomon, for the ships of the king went to Tharshish at the same time as the servants of Huram for a 3 years' voyage. These ships brought from Tharshish cargoes of gold, and silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Thus Solomon was greater than all the kings of the earth in wealth and science, and all the kings of the land sought the presence of Solomon to hear the sciences that God had placed in his mind, and each brought as his tribute articles of silver, and articles of gold, or fabrics, or armor, or spices, with horses and mules every year, yearly. For Solomon had 4,000 stables for horses and chariots, and 12,000 cavalry, whom he lodged in the chariot barracks, or with the king in Jerusalem. And he was emperor over all the kings from the river to the country of the Philistine, and as far as the border of the Mizraim. This king made silver in Jerusalem like stones, and he planted cedars like sycamores on the plain for number. And they brought horses to Solomon from Mizraim and from all other countries. The rest of the acts of Solomon, the first and the last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the reciter, and in the recitals of Achiah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Jaddai the seer against Jeroboam ben Nebat? Solomon, however, reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. Then Solomon slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him. The end of chapters 1 through 9. Recording by Mark Penfold. Chapter 10. Then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for the parliament of Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And it occurred that Jeroboam ben Nebat heard of it. He was in Mizraim, where he had fled from King Solomon, and Jeroboam resided amongst the Mizraim. But they sent and invited him, and Jeroboam came to the parliament of Israel, and they addressed Rehoboam and said, Your father was hard upon us, so will you lighten the slavery of your father's oppression, and lift up the load which he placed on us? Then we will serve you. When he replied to them, Wait for 3 days, and return to me. So the parliament went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the old men who had stood before his father Solomon while he was alive, and asked, What do you advise me in return as an answer to these people? And they said to him, If you make yourself pleasant to these people, and please them, and speak good words to them, they will then be your subjects for all time. But he rejected the advice of the old men which they had advised him, and asked advice of the lads who had grown up with him and stood in his presence, and said to them, What do you advise that I should return as answer to these people, who ask me, saying, Ease off what your father put on us? So the lads who had grown up with him said, Reply thus to the people who addressed you, saying, Your father loaded upon us, but you lighten off from us. Say this to them, My little finger is thicker than my father's loins, so as my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father scourged you with whips, but I with scorpions. Jeroboam and all the parliament with him returned to Rehoboam on the 3rd day, as the king had said to them, Come to me on the 3rd day, when the king answered them harshly. For King Rehoboam forsook the advice of the old men, and answered them in accordance upon the advice of the lads, and said, My father was heavy upon you, but I will add myself to him. My father chastised you with whips, but I with scorpions. Thus the king did not listen to the people. But it came round from God, so that he might confirm the message of the Lord, which was delivered by means of Achiah the Shilonite to Jeroboam ben Nebat. When the parliament of Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, then the people replied to the king, and exclaimed, What advantage have we in David? There is no benefit in the son of Jessai. Every one to your tents, Israel. Now look to your own house, David. And the army of Israel went to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who resided in the cities of Judah. King Rehoboam, however, sent to them Hadoram, who was superintendent of the conscription. But the children of Israel overwhelmed him with stones and killed him. So King Rehoboam got in a hurry into his carriage and fled to Jerusalem. Thus Israel rebelled from the house of David to this day. Chapter 11. When Rehoboam arrived at Jerusalem, he summoned from the houses of Judah and Benjamin 180,000 soldiers, trained for war, to fight with Israel, and to recover the kingship to Rehoboam. But a message from the Lord came to Shimeiah, a man of God, to say, Speak to Rehoboam ben Solomon, king of Judah, and to all Israel in Judah and Benjamin, and say, Thus says the ever-living, you shall not advance against nor fight with your brothers. Return every man to your houses, for this event has come from me. So they listened to the commands of the ever-living and refused to march against Jeroboam. Consequently Rehoboam returned to Jerusalem, but he built fortified cities in Judah. He also built Bethlehem, and Aitam, and Thekua, and Beth-Zur, and Shoko, and Adullam, and Gath, and Marsha, and Ziph, and Adorim, and Lachish, and Azkah, Sarah, and Ailon, and Hebron, which are fortified cities in Judah and Benjamin, of which he strengthened the defenses, and appointed commanders over them, with stores of food, and oil, and wine, and shields and arms, and made them very strong. So Judah and Benjamin remained his. The priests and Levites who were in Israel collected to him from all quarters, for the Levites abandoned their pasture lands and possessions, and emigrated to Judah and Jerusalem, because Jeroboam expelled them and their sons from the priesthood of the ever-living, and appointed priests for himself at the mounds, for the satyrs and calves that he made. Those also who gave their hearts to seek the ever-living God of Israel followed them, and came to Jerusalem to sacrifice to the God of their fathers. Thus they strengthened the kingdom of Judah, and invigorated Rehoboam the son of Solomon for 3 years, and he followed the path of David and Solomon for 3 years. Rehoboam took as his wife Machalath ben Jeremoth ben David, and Abichil the daughter Eliab ben Jesai, and she bore sons to him, Jeush, and Shebariah, and Zaham. And after her he married Maachah the daughter of Ariel of Gibeah, and she bore him Abiah, Athai, and Ziza, and Shelomith. And Rehoboam loved Maachah the daughter of Ariel more than all his wives and secondary wives, although he married 18 wives and 60 secondary wives, and begot 28 sons and 60 daughters. So Rehoboam appointed Abiah the son of Maachah as the chief, to rule amongst his brothers, and to make him king. Consequently he acted prudently, and distributed all his sons over the country of Judah and Benjamin in various fortified cities, and gave them liberal allowances, and selected a number of wives for them. Chapter 12. But when Rehoboam was fixed in the kingship, and had strengthened himself, he abandoned the laws of the ever-living, and all Israel followed him. Then in the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, Shishak the king of the Mizraim came up against Jerusalem, because they had risen against the ever-living, with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 cavalry, and an innumerable army with him, from the Mizraim, Lubim, Sukkaim, and Cushim. And they captured the fortified cities in Judah, and arrived at Jerusalem. Then Shemaiah the reciter came to Rehoboam and the princes of Judah, who had collected at Jerusalem in flight from Shishak, and said to them, Thus says the ever-living, you abandoned me, so I have abandoned you to the hand of Shishak. The princes of Israel and the king then humbled themselves, and replied, The ever-living is right. So when the Lord saw that they were penitent, a message from the ever-living came to Shemaiah to say, They have repented. I will not desolate them, but will give them in a little while an escape, and my anger shall not be passed on Jerusalem by the hand of Shishak, but they shall be his subjects, and learn the difference of subjection to me and subjection to the kings of the countries. But Shishak the king of the Mizraim advanced against Jerusalem, and took the treasures of the house of the ever-living, and all the treasures of the king's palace, and seized the golden shields that Solomon had made. King Rehoboam consequently made shields of brass instead of them, and entrusted them to the care of the general of the infantry, who kept guard before the royal palace. And when the king went to the house of the ever-living, the infantry came and carried them, then returned them to the infantry store. But when they were humiliated, the anger of the Lord turned from them, and they were not completely desolated. And comforting messages also came to Judah, so King Rehoboam settled himself in Jerusalem and reigned. Rehoboam was 41 years old at his coronation, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city that the ever-living had chosen from all the tribes of Israel to fix his name there. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonith. But he did wrong, for he did not fix his heart to seek the ever-living. However, the doings of Rehoboam, the first and the last, are they not recorded in the histories of Shemaiah the reciter, and also the prophet, with his genealogy, and the wars of Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the time? At last Rehoboam slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David, and Abiah his son reigned in his stead. Chapter 13. In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abiah began to reign over Judah. He was king for 3 years in Jerusalem, and the name of his mother was Maacah, the daughter of Ariel of Gibeah. When war began between Abiah and Jeroboam, Abiah arranged the battle with a force of disciplined soldiers of 400,000 men, and Jeroboam arrayed against him for battle with a force of 800,000 men, trained troops. And Abiah occupied the top of the Zimarim hills, which are in Mount Ephraim, and proclaimed, "Listen, Jeroboam and the army of Israel. Is it not known to you that the ever-living God of Israel gave the kingship over Israel to David forever, to him and to his sons by a covenant of salt? But Jeroboam ben Nebat, an officer of Solomon ben David, rebelled against his master, and idle fellows, men of Belial, collected to him and encouraged him against Rehoboam ben Solomon, when Rehoboam was young and light-hearted, and could not resist them. So now you think to resist the kingship of the Lord in the hand of the sons of David, because you are a great mob, and the golden calves that Jeroboam made for your gods are with you? Have you not expelled the priests of the ever-living, the Beni Aaron, and the Levites, and made yourselves priests like the peoples of the countries, so that everyone who goes to fill his hands with a bullock and 7 rams can become a priest to the not gods? But for us, the ever-living is our God, and we will not forsake him. And our priests who serve the ever-living are descendants of Aaron, and the Levites are assistants, who consume to the ever-living morning by morning burnt offerings, and evening by evening, and present perfumes, and arrange bread on the pure table with the golden lamps and their reflectors, to burn from dusk to dusk. For we regard the trusts of the ever-living our God, but you have abandoned them. So look out, for God is at our head, and his priests with trumpets to sound an alarm against you, sons of Israel. Fight not against the ever-living, the God of your fathers, for you will not prosper." But Jeroboam directed an ambush to go to their rear. Thus he was at the front of Judah, and the ambuscade at their rear. And when Judah turned, they saw there was a battle for them before and behind. So they cried to the ever-living, and the priests sounded with the trumpets. And the men of Judah cheered. And when the men of Judah cheered, God defeated Jeroboam and the Israelite forces before Abiah and Judah. Thus the children of Israel were routed before Judah, and God gave them into their hand. And Abiah and his army defeated them with a crushing defeat, and 500,000 brave men of Israel fell wounded. The children of Israel were consequently weakened from that time, and the children of Judah encouraged, because they relied on the ever-living God of their fathers. Abiah then followed after Jeroboam, and captured from him the cities of Bethel and its villages, and Jeshanah and its villages, and Ophren and its villages. And Jeroboam never recovered his strength in the times of Abiah, for the ever-living struck and defeated him. But Abiah was strengthened, and married 14 wives, and begot 22 sons and 16 daughters. The remainder of the deeds of Abiah and his proceedings and his affairs are recorded in the commentaries of the reciter Addo. Then Abiah slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David, and Asa his son reigned instead of him. In his time the country was at peace for 10 years. Chapter 14. Asa also did what was good and right in the eyes of the ever-living, and removed the foreign altars and the mounds, and broke the columns, and felled the groves, and commanded Judah to seek the ever-living God of their fathers, and to practice his laws and instructions. He also removed the mounds from the towns of Judah, and the images of the sun. So his reign was in peace before him. He also built fortresses in Judah, for the country was at rest, and he had no war in those years, for the ever-living was kind to him. Therefore he said to Judah, Let us be building these cities, and surround them with walls and forts, doors and bars, whilst the country is quiet. Now we have sought our ever-living God, and he has given us rest around. So they built and prospered. Yet Asa had an army who bore shield and spear of 300,000 men of Judah, and 280,000 from Benjamin who carried shields or drew the bow. All these were disciplined soldiers. Afterwards Zarach the Cushite advanced against them with an army of 1,000,000 and 300 chariots, and arrived at Mareshah. And Asa went out to meet him, and prepared to fight in the plain of Zephathah near Mareshah, where Asa cried to his ever-living God, and said, Lord, there is no difference with you when helping between the weak and the strong. Help us, our ever-living God, for we rely upon you, and in your name we come against this host. You are our ever-living God. Let not man prevail against you. And the ever-living routed the Cushites before Asa and before Judah, so the Cushites fled. But Asa pursued them with the force that was with him to Gerar, where he overwhelmed the Cushites and gave no quarter, for they were broken before the ever-living and before his army, and very great plunder was collected. He next assailed all the towns around Gerar, for a terror from the Lord came upon them, and sacked all the cities, for there was much property in them. They also attacked the cattle folds, and captured many sheep and camels, and afterwards returned to Jerusalem. Chapter 15. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Azariah ben Audad, and he went out to meet Asa, and said to him, Listen to me, Asa, and the army of Judah and Benjamin. The ever-living is with you, so you be with him. For if you seek him, he will be found by you, and if you abandon him, he will abandon you. For a long time Israel had had no true God or teaching priest, and no law. Yet when in its distress it turned to the God of Israel and sought him, he was found by them. And in those past times there was no safety in going out or in coming in, and revolutions came upon all the population of the country. Tribe assailed tribe, and city city. For God let them be tormented with every distress. But you be bold, and do not drop your hands, for your work will be rewarded. And when Asa heard these words, and the sermon of Audad the preacher, he was encouraged, and expelled the abominations from all the land of Judah and Benjamin, and from the towns he had captured in Mount Ephraim, and restored the altar of the ever-living that was before the porch of the Lord, and collected the representatives of Judah and Benjamin, and the settlers amongst them, from Ephraim and Manasseh and Simeon. For many from Israel had deserted to him when they saw that his ever-living God was with him. These assembled at Jerusalem in the 3rd month of the 15th year of the kingship of Asa, and sacrificed to the ever-living some of the prizes. They brought 700 bullocks and 7,000 sheep, and came to a resolution to seek the ever-living God of their forefathers with all their heart and all their mind, and that all who would not seek the ever-living God of Israel should be put to death, from the least to the greatest, whether man or woman, and swore it to the ever-living with a loud voice, and with cheering, and with trumpets and horns. And the representatives of Judah swore gladly, for they swore with complete heart, and sought him with full delight, and found him, for the ever-living gave them rest all around. King Asa also dismissed Maacah his mother from her station, because she had made a filthy image to lust. Asa also cut up the foul image, and crushed it, and flung it into the Kedron brook. He did not, however, remove the mounds from Israel. Yet the heart of Asa was sound all his days, and he brought all the consecrations of silver and gold of his father, and the consecrations of himself, into the house of the ever-living. There was no more war afterwards until the 35th year of the kingship of Asa. Chapter 16. In the 36th year of the kingship of Asa, Baasha king of Israel came up against Judah and built Ramah, so as not to allow a passage to Asa king of Judah. Asa consequently took silver and gold out of the treasures of the house of the ever-living, and the royal palace, and sent to Ben-Hadad king of Aram, who was resident in Damascus, and said, "There is a treaty between myself and you, as there was between my father and your father. Therefore I have sent silver and gold to you to break the treaty with Baasha king of Israel, that he may retreat from me." And Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa, and sent the generals of his forces against the cities of Israel. And they assailed Aon, and Dan, and Abel-maim, and all the prosperous towns of Naphtali. And when Baasha heard it, he ceased from the building of Ramah, and left his works. And King Asa took the forces of Judah, and carried off the stones and timber with which Baasha was building from Ramah, and built Geba and Mitzvah with them. But at that time Hanani the preacher came to Asa king of Judah, and said to him, "Because you have trusted yourself to the king of Aram, and have not trusted upon your ever-living God, the army of the king of Aram will slip from your hand. Were not the Cushim and the Lubim with their great army of chariots and horsemen very numerous? But because you relied upon the ever-living, they were given to your hand. For the eyes of the ever-living dart to all the earth to strengthen, if the heart is sound to him. You have done foolishly about this. Therefore from now there will be wars for you." Consequently Asa was furious at the seer, and put him into the prison of the stocks, for he was enraged with him about it. Asa also oppressed the people at the same time. But you must seek the beginning and end of the affairs of Asa, as they are recorded in the records of the kings of Judah and Israel. In the 39th year of his kingship, Asa became lame in his feet. His suffering was very great. However, in his suffering he did not consult the ever-living, but physicians. So Asa slept with his fathers, and died in the 41st year of his reign. But they buried him in his own tomb, which he had formed for himself in the city of David, and laid him on a bed that was filled with perfumes, and spices, and preservatives, prepared by chemists. They also burnt a very great burning for him. Chapter 17. And Jehoshaphat his son reigned in his place, and strengthened himself against Israel, and put a force in every fortified city of Judah, and appointed commanders in the country of Judah and in the cities of Ephraim that Asa his father had captured. For the ever-living was with Jehoshaphat, because he walked in the paths of David his ancestral father, and did not seek Baals, but the God of his fathers, and followed his instructions, and not as Israel did. Consequently the ever-living fixed the government in his hand, and all Judah paid tribute to Jehoshaphat, and he possessed wealth and much honor, and he exalted his heart in the paths of the ever-living, and he expelled the mounds and shrines from Judah. In the 3rd year of his reign also, he sent his officers Benkael and Abdiah, Zechariah and Nathanael and Micaiah to teach in the cities of Judah, and with them the Levites, Shemaiah, and Nathaniah, and Zechariah, and Asahel, and Shemiramoth, and Jehonathan, and Aduiah, and Tobiah, and Tob-Adoniah, the Levites, and Elishama, and Jehoram the priests, who taught in Judah. They had a book of the laws of the ever-living with them, and they went round in all the towns of Judah, and taught the people, so that a reverence for the ever-living came upon all the kings of the neighboring countries around Judah, and they did not fight with Jehoshaphat. The Philistine also brought tribute to Jehoshaphat, and a money tax, while the Arabians brought him of sheep 7,700 rams, and 7,700 he-goats. Thus Jehoshaphat advanced and increased continually, and built palaces in Judea and residential towns. He had many well-disciplined soldiers in the cities of Judah, and a large army of brave men in Jerusalem, whose commanders of their ancestral houses were the following. As generals in Judah were Adua, the commander-in-chief, and 300,000 soldiers under him. And his lieutenant was General Jehanan, and with him were 280,000. And under him Amasiah ben Zichri the volunteer, and with him 200,000 trained men. Eliada was the commander of the disciplined troops from Benjamin, and had with him of archers and shieldmen 200,000. His lieutenant was Jehozabad, who contracted for 180,000 armed for war. These served the king, besides those the king placed in the fortified cities of Judah. Chapter 18. Jehoshaphat thus possessed wealth and honor in plenty, and made friendship with Ahab, and went down at the end of summer to Ahab at Shomeron, when Ahab sacrificed many sheep and oxen, as did his people, and he persuaded him to advance against Ramoth-Gilead. For Ahab king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat king of Judah, "Will you go with me to Ramoth-Gilead?" When he replied, "You and I are alike, and your people as my people in battle." But Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "Let us, I pray, inquire what day the ever-living says." The king of Israel consequently collected 700 men of his preachers, and asked them, "Should we go up to Ramoth-Gilead to fight, or refrain?" And they replied, "Advance, and the gods will give it to the hand of the king." But Jehoshaphat asked, "Is there not here any preacher of the ever-living, that we may inquire from him?" And the king of Israel replied to Jehoshaphat, "There is one man from whom we could inquire of the ever-living, but I hate him, for he never proclaims success to me, but misfortune all his time. He is Micaiah ben Imlah." Jehoshaphat, however, answered, "Let not the king say so." The king of Israel therefore called to a chamberlain, and said, "Bring Micaiah ben Imlah." And the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat king of Judah each sat on his throne, clothed in splendid robes, and placed in the square opposite the gate of Shomeron, with all the preachers reciting before them. And Zedekiah ben Kenaniah had made iron horns for himself, and exclaimed, "Thus says the ever-living, you shall push Aram with these to destruction." And all the preachers recited the same, and said, "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king." Consequently the messenger who had gone to invite Micaiah said to him, "You will perceive the promises of the preachers are unanimously for good to the king. So let your promise be like one of theirs, and promise good." But Micaiah answered, "By the life of the ever-living, whatever God commands by me to him, I shall say." When they came to the king asked him, "Micaiah, should I go to Ramoth-Gilead to fight, or should I refrain?" And he replied, "Go up and prosper, when they are given to your hand." But the king answered him, "How often must I put you on oath that you will not speak to me except the truth in the name of the ever-living?" Then he replied, "I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, like sheep who have no shepherd, and the ever-living asked, 'Have these no masters? Let everyone return to its own home in peace.'" Consequently the king of Israel exclaimed to Jehoshaphat, "Did I not tell you he would not proclaim good to me, but only misfortune?" So he answered, "Therefore hear the message of the ever-living. I saw the ever-living seated on his throne, and all the hosts of the heavens stationed on his right hand and on his left. And when the ever-living asked, 'Who will entice Ahab king of Israel, so that he may go up and fall at Ramoth-Gilead?' And this one said thus, and another said that. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the ever-living, and said, 'I will entice him.' When the ever-living asked him how, and he replied, 'I will go and become a lying spirit in the mouth of all his preachers.' So he answered, 'You may entice him and also succeed. Go and do so.' And now look, the ever-living has put a lying spirit into the mouth of those preachers of yours, but the ever-living told me bad news about you." Then Zedekiah ben Kenaniah approached, and struck Micaiah on the jaw, and asked, "By what road did the spirit from the ever-living pass from me to speak to you?" When Micaiah answered, "You will see on that day, when you go to an inner chamber to hide yourself." Then the king of Israel exclaimed, "Seize Micaiah, and hand him to Amon the commandant of the citadel, and to the prince Joash, and say to them, 'Put this fellow into the prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I return in safety." But Micaiah replied, "If you return in safety, the ever-living has not spoken by me." Then he shouted, "Listen, all you people!" So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat king of Judah advanced to Ramoth-Gilead, where the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "I will disguise myself when going to battle, but you shall wear your robes." The king of Israel consequently disguised himself when he went to battle. The king of Aram, however, had ordered the commanders of his chariots, saying, "Do not fight with small or great, but only with the king of Israel himself." So when the commanders of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat, they said, "That is the king of Israel," and they surrounded him to fight. But Jehoshaphat cried out when the Lord helped him, and God made him escape from them. Then, when the commanders of the chariots perceived that he was not the king of Israel, they returned from following him. A man, however, drew a bow at a venture, and hit the king of Israel between the joints of his armor, when he said to his charioteer, "Pull in your hand, and take me out of the battle, for I am wounded." The battle, however, went on that day, and the king of Israel was supported in his chariot opposite Aram until the evening, but he died at the time of sunset. The end of chapters 10 through 18. Recording by Mark Penfold. Chapter 19. But Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, returned to his home at Jerusalem in safety. However, Jehuah ben Hanani, the prophet, went out to meet him and said to the king Jehoshaphat, "Why did you help the wicked and love the haters of Jehovah? For that the wrath of the Lord is on you. However, good things are found in you, for you expelled Ashroth from the land and settled your heart to seek your God." Thus Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem and rested. He afterwards traveled amongst the people from Beersheba to Mount Ephraim, and turned them to the ever-living God of their fathers. He also established judges in the country, in every fortified town of Judea, from city to city, and said to the judges, "Be careful in what you do, for you do not decide for man, but for the ever-living, who is with you when you are pronouncing judgment. Therefore, let the fear of the ever-living be upon you. Be careful when deciding, for there is no corruption with our ever-living God, or making pretenses, or taking of bribes." In the same way, Jehoshaphat appointed judges in Jerusalem from the Levites and priests, and from the ancestral chiefs of Israel, for the decrees of the ever-living, and for appeals. Those resided in Jerusalem, and he commanded them, "You shall do thus, and examine for the ever-living in faithfulness and purity of heart, and in every appeal that comes to you from your associates who reside in the towns, between blood and blood, between law and command, or institution, or decrees. You shall advise them not to offend against the ever-living, or there will be anger against you and your associates. Do that, and you will do no wrong. And you see Amarihu, the chief of the priests, is your superintendent in all matters about the ever-living, with Zebediah ben Ishmael, the prince of the house of Judah, for any affairs of the king, and the Levites will be present with you as recorders. Be earnest and act, and may the ever-living be with you in good." Chapter 20. It occurred after this that the Beni Moab and Beni Ammon with some of the Menim came to war against Jehoshaphat. And messengers came and reported it to Jehoshaphat, saying, "A great multitude from Aram beyond the lake is advancing, and are at Hazaron Tamar, that is, En-gedi." Jehoshaphat consequently was afraid, and turned himself to inquire of the ever-living, and proclaimed a fast to all Judea. Judea therefore collected to entreat from the ever-living, and came from all the cities of Judea to entreat the Lord. When Jehoshaphat stood up in the parliament of Judea and Jerusalem, in the house of the ever-living, in front of the new court, and said, "Ever-living God of our fathers, are you not God in the heavens? and you rule in all the kingdoms of the heathen, and power and might are in your hands, and none can resist you. Are not you our God, who drove out the inhabitants of this country before your people of Israel, and gave it to the race of Abraham, your friend, forever? And they have dwelt in it, and have built a sanctuary to your name in it, reflecting, if trouble comes upon us, the punishing sword, or plague, or famine, we can stand before this temple, and before you, for your name is in this temple, and cry to you on our distresses. You will listen and hear. So now see, the Benaiaman and Moab and Mount Seir, that it was not granted to Israel to assail, when they came from the land of the Mitzrayim, so they turned from them and did not ravage them. Yet look at them, how they reward us by coming to expel us from your inheritance, which you allowed us to possess. Our God, is there no punishment for them? For we have no power before this great host that is coming against us, so we know not what to do, but our eyes are on you. And the representatives of Judea stood before the Lord with their infants and wives and sons. And Ichhaziel ben Zechariah ben Benaiah ben Jazal ben Mathaniah, the Levite of the Beni Asaph, had the Spirit of the ever-living come upon him in the middle of the assembly, and exclaimed, Listen, representatives of Judea and inhabitants of Jerusalem, with King Jehoshaphat. Thus says the ever-living to you, Fear not for yourselves, nor be dejected in the presence of this great host, for the battle is not with you, but with God. Descend against them tomorrow. You will see them ascending by the ascent of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the stream opposite the pastures of Jeruel. You need not fight with them. Station yourselves, stand, and see the victory of the ever-living for you. Fear not, and be not depressed, Judah and Jerusalem. Go out tomorrow to meet them, and the ever-living will be with you. Then Jehoshaphat bent his face earthward, and the representatives of Judea and the inhabitants of Jerusalem fell before the ever-living, and bowed to the Lord. But the Levites of the Beni Kath and the Beni Korach arose and praised the ever-living God of Israel with a loud and high voice. Early in the morning they aroused and marched out to the pastures of Tekoa. But before their march Jehoshaphat stood up and said, Listen to me, Judah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Trust upon your ever-living God, and trust yourselves. Trust on his preachers, and you will succeed. And having arranged the army, he appointed singers to the ever-living, and they went with sacred splendor, marching before the troops, and exclaiming, Praise the Lord, for his mercy endures forever. And at the moment they began to cheer and praise, the ever-living acted unexpectedly against the Benaiaman, Moab, and Mount Seir, who were advancing against Judah, and routed them. For the Benaiaman and Moab assailed the people of Mount Seir with slaughter and destruction, and when they had destroyed the people of Mount Seir, each helped to ruin the other. So when Judah came to the watchtower in the pastures and advanced towards the host, they saw their carcasses fallen on the earth without fugitives. Then Jehoshaphat and his army went to seize the plunder, and found amongst it property, and clothing, and beautiful jewels, which they stripped for themselves, more than they could carry. And they were 3 days collecting the spoil, for it was great. On the 4th day they assembled in the Vale of Thanks, where they thanked the ever-living. Therefore they called the name of the place, the Vale Thanks, to this day. Then all the men of Judah and Jerusalem returned with Jehoshaphat at their head, and came to Jerusalem with delight, for the ever-living had delighted them upon their enemies. So they came to Jerusalem with lutes and harps and trumpets, and to the temple of the ever-living. A terror of the ever-living afterwards came upon all the kingdoms of the heathen when they heard how the Lord had fought against the enemies of Israel. Consequently, the empire of Jehoshaphat had rest, and the ever-living gave him comfort all around. Thus Jehoshaphat reigned over Judea. He was 35 years old at his coronation, and was king in Jerusalem for 25 years. His mother's name was Azubah, the daughter of Shilkai. He walked in the path of his father Asa, and never turned from it, but did right in the eyes of the ever-living. However, he did not overthrow the mounds, and the people did not yet fix their hearts on the God of their ancestors. But the remainder of the affairs of Jehoshaphat, the first and the last, can be seen recorded in the history of Jehu ben Hanani, who was superintendent of the records of the kings of Israel. After this, Jehoshaphat king of Judea united himself with Ahaziah king of Israel, which was a wrong act. He, however, united with him to build ships to go to Tarshish. They also built ships at Ezion-Gaber. Consequently, Eleazar ben Dodavahu of Maresheth preached against Jehoshaphat and said, "Because you have united with Ahaziah, the ever-living will break your efforts, and the ships will be wrecked, and not be able to go to Tarshish." Chapter 21. At last Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers, and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, and Jehoram his son reigned instead of him. His brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat, were Azariah, Jechiel, and Zechariah, and Azriah, and Michal, and Shephatiah. All these were sons of Jehoshaphat, king of Israel, and their father gave them large endowments in money and property, with fortified towns in Judea, but gave the kingdom to Jehoram, because he was his firstborn. But when Jehoram arose to the dominions of his father, and had secured himself, he murdered the whole of his brothers, and also some of the nobles of Israel. Jehoram was 32 years of age at his coronation, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, and followed the path of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab did, for the daughter of Ahab became his wife. So he did evil in the eyes of the ever-living. But the ever-living did not wish to desolate the house of David because of the covenant made with David, and because he promised to give a light to him and his sons for all time. In his days Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah, and elected a king over themselves. Jehoram therefore advanced along with his generals and all his chariots. But he was risen upon in the night, and was defeated by Edom, who surrounded himself, and the commanders of his chariots. Thus Edom revolted from under the hand of Judea to this day. Libnah also at the same time revolted from under his hand, because he had abandoned the ever-living God of his fathers. He also erected mounds in the cities of Judah, and caused the population of Jerusalem to whore, and forced Judea to do it. So a letter came to him from Elisha the preacher, to say, "Thus says the ever-living, the God of David your ancestor, since you have not followed the course of your father Jehoshaphat and the path of Asa, king of Judea, but have walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and have prostituted Judea and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, as the house of Ahab prostituted, and also have murdered your brothers of your father's family who were better than yourself, be sure the ever-living will strike with a great disease your children, and your wives, and property, and all your people, and yourself with many diseases in your bowels, until your bowels will come out day by day in consequence of your disease." The ever-living consequently aroused the spirit of the Philistine against Jehoram, with the Arabians, who were at the side of the Cushim, and they came up to Judea, and broke into it, and captured all the property they found belonging to the family of the king, and also his children and wives, and did not leave him a child, except Jehoahaz, his youngest son. And after all that, the ever-living struck him within his bowels with an incurable disease, which recurred from day to day. And as time went on, at the end of a period of 2 years, his bowels came out in consequence of his disease, and he died in grievous sufferings. Consequently, his people did not make burnings for him like the burnings for his fathers. At his coronation he was 32 years of age, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years, and he departed unregretted. So they buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Chapter 22. Then the population of Jerusalem elected Ahaziah his youngest son in his place, for all the elder ones had been murdered by the troops who came with the army of the Arabians. So Ahaziah ben Jehoram reigned in Judea. Ahaziah was 22 years old at his coronation, and reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Amri. He also followed the courses of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his wicked adviser. He consequently did evil in the eyes of the ever-living, like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors after the death of his father, and destroyed him. So he followed their advice, and went with Jehoram ben Ahab, king of Israel, to fight against the king of Aram at Ramoth-Gilead, where the Aramites wounded Jehoram, who returned to Jezreel to be cured of the wounds which he had received at Ramoth in his fight with Hazael, king of Aram. So Azariah ben Jehoram, king of Judea, descended to see Jehoram ben Achab in Jezreel, where he was an invalid. But the degradation of Ahaziah came from God by his going to Jehoram, for on his visit he went out with Jehoram against Jehu ben Nimshi, who the ever-living had consecrated to cut off the house of Ahab. For it happened that when Jehu was executing the family of Ahab, he found the nobles of Judea and the sons of the brothers of Ahaziah attending to Ahaziah, and he murdered them. He also searched out Ahaziah and captured him, for he was hidden in Shomeron, and he was brought to Jehu, who killed him. But they buried him, for they said, "He was descended from Jehoshaphat, who sought the ever-living with all his heart." Thus none of the family of Ahaziah attained power in the government. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose with intention to destroy all the royal race of the house of Judah. But the royal princess Jehoshabath took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from amongst the children of the king who were being killed, and placed him and his nurse in a bedchamber. Thus Jehoshabath, the daughter of King Jehoram, the wife of Jehoiada the priest, concealed him, for she was sister of Ahaziah, from Athaliah, so that he was not killed, but was hidden with them for 6 years, while Athaliah was queen over the country. Chapter 23. But in the 7th year Jehoiada emboldened himself, and took Azariah ben Jeroham, and Ishmael ben Jochanan, and Azariah ben Obed, and Messiah ben Adihu, and Elishaphat ben Zichri, captains in the army, into his confidence, and they travelled about Judea, and invited the Levites from all the towns of Judea, and the ancestral chiefs of Israel, to come to Jerusalem, when all those assembled made an agreement in the house of God with the king. Then he said to them, "You know that a prince should reign, as the ever-living promised to the sons of David. What you must do, therefore, is this. A third part of you must come on the Sabbath to the priests and Levites who guard the thresholds of the gates, and a third go to the royal palace, and a third go to the gate of consultation, when all the people are in the courts of the house of the ever-living. But let none enter the Lord's house, except the priests who minister with the Levites. They may enter, for they are sacred. And let all your forces guard the ministrations of the ever-living. Then let the Levites close round the king, each with his vessels in his hands, but kill all else who wish to enter the temple. But you must accompany the king when he enters and when he departs." So the Levites and the representatives of Judea did everything as Jehoiada the priest ordered, and each took his men on the arrival of the Sabbath on which they were to act, when Jehoiada the priest did not dismiss the courses. Jehoiada the priest then gave the captains the spears and shields and bucklers which had been King David's, and were in the temple of God. He next stationed all the force, each with his weapon in his hand, from the right shoulder of the temple to the left shoulder of the temple, and from the altar to surround the royal apartment. Afterwards he brought out the prince, and they paid homage to him, and administered the oath, and crowned him. Jehoiada and his sons consecrated him, and exclaimed, "May the king live!" Athaliah, however, heard the noise of the people running and cheering the king. So she came to the parliament in the house of the ever-living, and when she looked and saw the king standing on a platform at the entrance, with the nobles and trumpeters around the king, and all the people in the place in delight, and the trumpeters and singers sounding with their instruments of music as a choir of thanksgiving, then Athaliah tore her robes and exclaimed, "Treason! Treason!" But Jehoiada the priest ordered out the captains he had appointed over the force, and said to them, "Take her out from among the troops, and whoever follows her, let him die by the sword." For the priest said, "Do not kill her in the house of the ever-living." So they laid their hand on her, and brought her to the entrance of the horse gate of the royal palace, and killed her there. Jehoiada afterwards wrote a treaty between himself and the representatives of the people and the king, that they would be the people of the ever-living. All the people afterwards went to the temple of Baal, and threw down his altar, and shattered his image, and killed Mathan the priest of Baal before his altar. Jehoiada subsequently appointed officers for the house of the ever-living, beside the priests and Levites, whom David had arranged for the Lord's temple, to offer presentations to the ever-living, as they are directed in the laws of Moses, and to rejoice and sing as arranged by David. And he appointed doorkeepers at the gates of the ever-living's temple, so that anything unclean might not enter. After that he assembled the military officers, and the nobles, and the governors of the people, and the representatives of the people of the country, and brought the king down from the house of the ever-living, and proceeded through the high gate to the royal palace, and placed the king on the throne of government. And all the representatives of the people of the country rejoiced that they had killed Athaliah with the sword. Chapter 24. Jehoash was 7 years old at his coronation, and reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. And Jehoash did right in the eyes of the ever-living all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada chose 2 wives for him, and he begot sons and daughters. It ultimately came into the mind of Jehoash to repair the temple of the ever-living, so he assembled the priests and Levites, and said to them, "Go out to the towns of Judea, and collect money from all Israel, to restore the house of your God from year to year, and be energetic in the matter." But the Levites were not energetic. The king consequently summoned Jehoiada their chief, and asked him, "Why have you not ordered the Levites to bring in from Judea and Jerusalem the tax of Moses the minister of the ever-living, and of the parliament of Israel for the hall of witnesses? Although the infamous Athaliah and her sons dilapidated the house of God, and also used the sacred thing of the Lord's temple for their Baals." The king then ordered, and they made a chest, and placed it at the outer gate of the temple of the ever-living. He also made a proclamation to Judea and Jerusalem to bring to the ever-living the taxes which Moses, the servant of the Lord, laid upon Israel in the desert. This pleased all the nobles and people, and they brought them and poured into the chest until it was full. And when the chest was brought to the king's accountants by the Levites, and they saw that there was much money, the clerks of the king came with an officer of the high priest, and emptied the chest, then returned it to its place again. They did this from time to time, and collected a quantity of money, which the king and Jehoiada gave to carry out the works about the house of the ever-living, and to pay the wages of the masons and carpenters who repaired the temple of the ever-living. And the workmen did the work, and it proceeded regularly under their hands. They thus built up the house of God in its proportions, and restored it. When they had completed it, they brought the rest of the money to the king and Jehoiada the priest, who made vessels for the house of the ever-living, vessels for the services and offerings, and cups, and furniture of gold and silver, which were for use in the offerings at the ever-living's temple continually all the time of Jehoiada. But Jehoiada grew old, and satiated with days, and died, 130 years old at his death. And they buried him in the city of David with the kings, because he had benefited Israel, both towards God and his house. But after the death of Jehoiada, the nobles of Judea came and flattered the king, and the king listened to them, and they forsook the house of the ever-living God of their fathers, and served the idols of lust and other idols. So anger came upon Judea and Jerusalem because of their sins. However, he sent preachers to turn them back to the ever-living and to warn them, but they would not listen. Consequently, the Spirit of God clothed itself in Zechariah ben Jehoiada the priest, and he stood up before the parliament and said to them, God asks this, why do you transgress the instructions of the ever-living? You do not prosper, because you have abandoned the Lord. He will abandon you. They, however, conspired against him and murdered him by stoning, by the command of the king, in the court of the house of the ever-living. For Jehoash the king did not remember the kindness that Jehoiada his father had shown to him, but murdered his son, who, as he died, exclaimed, The ever-living sees, and will inquire for it. And indeed, on the revolution of a year, the army of Aram came up against him, and entered Judea and Jerusalem, and ruined the great nobles of the people, with the parliament, and sent all the booty to the king of Damascus. Although the Aramite army came with a small number of men, yet the ever-living gave a very large force into its power, because they had abandoned their ever-living God. Thus justice was executed upon Jehoash. And when they retired, leaving him in many troubles, his ministers conspired against him on account of the blood of the son of Jehoiada the priest, and murdered him on his bed. Thus he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but he was not buried in the tombs of the kings. The following were the conspirators against him: Zabad ben Shemath the Ammonite, and Jozabad ben Shimerith the Moabite. But about his sons, and the great load upon him, and his repairing of the house of God, can be seen related in the record books of the kings. His son Amaziah reigned after him, who executed his father's murderers. Chapter 25. Amaziah was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoadan of Jerusalem. He did right in the eyes of the ever-living, yet not with a constant heart. When he became secure in the government, however, he slew those ministers who had assaulted the king his father, but he did not kill their children. For it is written in the book of the laws of Moses, as the ever-living commanded expressly, You shall not kill the fathers on account of their children, nor the children on account of their fathers, but each man shall be put to death for his own crime. Amaziah then assembled Judea, and organized the ancestral houses, with generals and captains for all Judah and Benjamin, regimenting them from the age of 20 years and upward, and formed from them 300,000 troops to go out for war, trained to spear and shield. He also hired from Israel 100,000 trained soldiers, for 100 talents of silver. But a man of God came and said to the king, Israel must not go out with you in war, for the ever-living is not with Israel, or any of the sons of Ephraim. Therefore, if you go out with them, made strong for battle, God will defeat you before the enemy, because there is power with God to help or to defeat. Amaziah, however, asked the man of God, What am I to do for the 100 talents of silver which I have paid the Israelite troops? When the man of God replied, God is the Lord, he can give you more than that. Consequently, Amaziah disbanded the troops who had come to him from Ephraim, and marched them home. They were, however, very furious against Judah, and returned to their homes in burning anger. Amaziah then emboldened himself, and let his people out, and marched to the Vale of Salt, and slew 10,000 of the Beni Sair. The children of Judah also captured 10,000 persons, and brought them to the top of the crags, and threw them from the top of the cliffs, and they were all broken. In the meantime, the men of the troops whom Amaziah had dismissed from marching with him to the war flung themselves upon the villages of Judea, from Shomeron and Bath-horon, and slew 30,000, and plundered a great booty. When Amaziah came back from defeating the Edomites, he brought the gods of the Beni Sair, and set them up as his own gods, and bowed before them, and made offerings to them. The ever-living was consequently angry with Amaziah, and sent a preacher to him, who asked him, "Why have you sought the gods of a people who could not deliver that people from your hand?" But while he was addressing him, he replied to him, "Who made you adviser to the king? Drop it. Why would you kill yourself?" So the preacher ceased, after saying, "I warn you that God intends to destroy you for having done that, and not listening to my advice." Amaziah, king of Judah, however, advised himself, and sent to Joash ben Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, king of Israel, to say, "Come on, let us look face to face." But Joash, king of Israel, sent to Amaziah, king of Judea, in reply, "The bramble that was in Lebanon sent to the cedar that was in Lebanon to say, 'Give your daughter to my son as a wife,' when a beast of the field that was in Lebanon passed over, and trampled the bramble down. You think, 'Look, I have defeated Edom,' so your heart is exalted, and you boast. Stay in your home. Why should you incite yourself to suffer by it, and fall, and Judah with you?" But Amaziah would not listen, for it was from God, because he had pledged himself that he would worship the gods of Edom. Consequently, Joash, king of Israel, advanced, and they met face to face, he and Amaziah, king of Judea, at Beth Shemesh in Judea, where Judea was routed before Israel, and each fled to his home. And Amaziah, king of Judah, ben Joash, ben Jehoahaz, was captured by Joash, king of Israel, at Beth Shemesh, who brought him to Jerusalem, where he broke down the walls of Jerusalem from the gate of Ephraim to the corner gate for 400 cubits. He also transferred all the gold and silver, and all the vessels that he found in the house of God, with Abed-edom, and the treasuries of the royal palace, with the securities, and lodged them in Shomeron. But Amaziah ben Joash, king of Judea, lived after the death of Joash ben Jehoahaz, king of Israel, for 15 years. The rest of the events of Amaziah, the first and the last, can be seen recorded in the records of the kings of Judea and Israel. But after the time that Amaziah revolted from the ever-living, they contrived a conspiracy against him in Jerusalem, and he fled to Lachish. They, however, sent after him to Lachish, and killed him there, and carried him on horses, and buried him with his fathers in a village of Judea. Chapter 26. Then the parliament of Judea took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and crowned him in place of his father Amaziah. He built Aloth, which he recovered for Judea, after that king slept with his fathers. Uzziah was 16 years old at his coronation, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. He did right in the sight of the ever-living, in all that his father Amaziah had done, and sought God in the days of Zechariah, the instructor in the manifestation of God. And in the period when he sought the ever-living, God gave him success. So he went out and fought with the Philistine, and broke the wall of Gath, and the wall of Jabneh, and the wall of Ashdod, and Jabneh in the wood, and built cities near Ashdod and amongst the Philistine. For God helped him against the Philistine, and against the Arabians, and the population of Garbal, Mananim. The Ammonites also paid tribute to Uzziah, and his power extended to the passage into Mitzrayim, for he advanced to high power. Uzziah also built forts in the pastures, and excavated many reservoirs, for he had much cattle, both on the slopes and the plain, with farms and vineyards on the hills, and in Carmel, for he was a lover of the ground. Uzziah had also an army trained for war, who went out to war in numbered regiments, under the control of Javal the secretary, and Messiah the organizer, under the command of Hananiah the general of the king. The whole number of ancestral chiefs in the army was 2,600, and under their hand a warlike force of 307,500 disciplined for battle, a powerful force to support the king against the enemy. And Uzziah provided them with shields and spears, and helmets, and armor, and bows, and stone slings. He also made artillery in Jerusalem, contrived to be fixed in the forts and at the bastions, to shoot arrows and great stones. His fame consequently went out afar, for he was remarkably skilful as well as bold. But as he strengthened himself, his heart mounted to destruction, and he sinned against his ever-living God. For he entered the temple of the ever-living to offer incense on the altar of incense. But Azariah the priest entered after him, and 80 priests of the ever-living with him, brave men, who withstood Uzziah the king, and said to him, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to offer incense to the ever-living, but for the priests, the descendants of Aaron, who are consecrated to offer incense. Go from the sanctuary, for you have sinned, and it will not be accepted from you by the ever-living God." And Uzziah was furious, but had the censer in his hand to offer incense, and in his fury with the priests, the leprosy rose up in his forehead before the priests, in the house of the ever-living, beside the altar of incense. Then Azariah the chief priest and all the priests turned upon him, and saw that he was a leper in the forehead, so dragged him from there, and he also hasted to go out, for the ever-living afflicted him. Thus King Uzziah became a leper to the day of his death, and resided in a house of retreat for lepers, for he was excommunicated from the house of the ever-living. And Jotham his son governed the people of the country from the royal palace. But the other acts of Uzziah, the first and the last, Isaiah ben Amoz the preacher wrote. Then Uzziah slept with his fathers. They buried him with his ancestors in a field where the kings were not. For, they said, he was a leper. Then his son Jotham reigned in his stead. Chapter 27. Jotham was 25 years of age at his coronation, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. He also did right in the eyes of the ever-living, as Uzziah his father did. But he did not enter the temple of the ever-living, whilst the people continued their corruptions. He rebuilt the high gate of the house of the Lord, and rebuilt a great part of the walls of Ophel. He also built towns in the highlands of Judea, and erected castles and towers in the jungles. However, he had war with the Benaiamin, and conquered them, and the Benaiamin paid him yearly 100 talents of silver, and 10,000 cores of wheat, with 10,000 of barley. The Benaiamin paid this to him year by year for 3 years. Thus Jotham became powerful, because he fixed his courses before the Lord his God. Regarding the remainder of the affairs of Jotham, and all his wars, and his conduct, they can be seen in the records of the kings of Israel and Judea. He was 25 years old at his coronation, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. Then Jotham slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David, and Ahaz his son reigned in his place. The end of chapters 19 through 27. Recording by Mark Penfold. Chapter 28. Ahaz was 20 years old at his coronation, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and did not do right in the eyes of the Lord, like David his ancestor, but followed the courses of the kings of Israel, and also made temples to Baalim. Beside, he burned incense in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and burnt his children in the fire, like the abominable heathen whom the ever-living drove out before the children of Israel. And he sacrificed and offered incense on the mounds, and on the hills, and under every shady tree. Consequently the ever-living God delivered him to the hand of the king of Aram, who defeated him, and captured a great many from us as prisoners, and brought them to Damascus. He also gave him to the power of the king of Israel, who defeated him with a great slaughter, when Pekah ben Ramaliah killed on one day in Judea 120,000, all disciplined soldiers, because he had abandoned the ever-living God of his fathers. And Zikri, a general of Ephraim, killed the king's son, Messiah, and Azrikam, the superintendent of his palace, and Elkanah, the king's prime minister. After that they captured of the children of Israel 200,000 men and women, and plundered much property from them, and carried the plunder to Shomeron. A preacher of the ever-living was there, however, named Adad, and he went out to meet the army as it advanced to Shomeron, and said to it, "Look, because the ever-living God of our ancestors was angry against Judea, he gave it into your hands. But you have slaughtered amongst them in a fury that has reached the heavens. And now you propose to degrade into bondmen and women for yourselves the sons of Judah and Jerusalem. But have you yourselves no sins against your ever-living God? Therefore listen to me now. Send back the captives whom you have dragged after you, or the indignation of the ever-living will be upon you." Then some men of the chiefs of the children of Ephraim stood up, Azariah ben Jehohanan, Berechiah ben Meshillemoth, and Jechiziah ben Shallum, and Amasa ben Kadai, against those who came from the army, and said to them, "You shall not bring the captives here, for the indignation of the ever-living would come upon us. Do you intend to add to our sins and to our offenses? Our sins are quite enough for us, and the burning anger of the ever-living is upon Israel." The soldiers consequently resigned the captives and their property to the generals, and all the senate, and the princes, who have been specified by name, arose and comforted the captives, and clothed all the naked amongst them from the spoil, and shod them, and fed them, and gave them drink, and anointed them, and mounted all the feeble of them upon asses, and took them to Jericho, the city of palms, to the shelter of their countrymen, and then returned to Shomeron. At this time King Ahaz sent to the king of Aram to help him, for the Edomites had come and attacked Judea and carried off captives. The Philistine also in the cities on the slope and the south revolted from Judah, and captured Beth Shemesh, and Ailon, and Gederon, and Soko and its villages, and Timnah and its villages, and Gimzo and its villages, and stayed there. For Judea had provoked the ever-living by means of Ahaz king of Judea, who had become lawless in Judea, and sinned grievously against the Lord. So Tilgath-Pilneser king of Ashur came, and consulted with him, but did not strengthen him. Although Ahaz contributed from the house of the ever-living, and the royal palace, and from the nobles, and paid the king of Ashur, he was no help to him. Yet King Ahaz sinned still more against the ever-living in the period of his distress, for he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus who defeated him, and said, "Because the gods of the king of Damascus help him, I will sacrifice to them so that they may help me." But they were to him and all Israel a cause of ruin. So Ahaz collected the vessels of the house of God, and cut up the vessels of God's house, and closed the doors of the house of the ever-living, and made altars for himself in all the squares of Jerusalem. In every city of Judah he also made mounds to offer incense to seducing gods, and provoked the ever-living God of his fathers. But his other doings and all his courses, the first and the last, can be seen written in the records of the kings of Judah and Israel. At last Ahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of Jerusalem, for they would not bring him to the tombs of the kings of Israel. Then his son Hezekiah reigned instead of him. Chapter 29. King Hezekiah was 25 years old, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abiah, the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the eyes of the ever-living, as David his ancestor had done. He, in the first month of the first year of his coronation, opened the doors of the house of the ever-living, and repaired it. Then he brought the priests and Levites, and assembled them in the east square, and said to them, "Listen now to me, you Levites. Consecrate yourselves, and consecrate the house of the ever-living, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the sanctuary. For our fathers sinned, and did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living God, and abandoned and turned away their faces from the dwelling of the ever-living, and turned their backs. They even closed the doors of his hall, and put out the lamps, and burnt no incense, and burnt no offerings in the sanctuary to the God of Israel. Consequently, the anger of the ever-living came upon Judea and Jerusalem, so he delivered them to agitation, and terror, and perplexity, as we can see with our eyes. For look, our fathers fell by the sword, and our sons and our daughters and our wives were captured on account of it. However, it is in my heart to make a covenant with the ever-living God of Israel, that he may turn from us his indignant anger. My sons, be not idle, for the ever-living chose you to stand before him, and to minister to him, and to be ministers, and to offer incense." Then the Levites arose, Machath ben Amasai, and Joel ben Azariah of the Beni Kath, and of the Beni Merari, Kish ben Abdi, and Azariah ben Jechilalel, and from the Gershoni, Joach ben Zima, and Aden ben Joach, and from the Beni Elizaphan, Shimri and Javal, and from the Beni Asaph, Zechariah and Mathaniah, and from the Beni Haman, Jechoal and Shimei, and from the Beni Jeduthun, Shemaiah and Aziel, who collected their relatives and consecrated themselves, and went, as the king ordered, to the business of the ever-living, to purify the house of the Lord. But the priests preceded them to the house of the ever-living to purify it, and they flung out all the defilement that they found in the sanctuary of the ever-living, and the court of the Lord's house, and the Levites carried it out to the brook of Kidron. They began on the 1st day of the 1st month to cleanse, and on the 8th day of the month they reached the porch of the ever-living, and consecrated the house of the ever-living for 8 days, and finished on the 16th day of the 1st month. They then went to the presence of King Hezekiah, and said, "We have cleansed all the house of the ever-living, and the altar of burnt offerings, and all its instruments, and the table of the showbread with all its appliances, and all the instruments which King Ahaz defiled in his reign by his crimes, we have repaired and consecrated, and you can see them before the altar of the ever-living." King Hezekiah consequently made ready and assembled the nobles of the city, and they went up to the house of the ever-living, and brought 7 bullocks and 7 rams, with 7 lambs and 7 perfect goats, for sin offerings, for the kingdom, and for the sanctuary, and for Judea, and commanded to the descendants of Aaron, the priests and Levites, to offer them on the altar of the ever-living. So they slaughtered the bullocks, and the priests took the blood and sprinkled it upon the altar. Then they brought the goats for the sin offerings before the king and the parliament, and they laid their hands upon them. The priests afterwards slew them, and made with their blood sin offerings on the altar, to expiate for all Israel. "Because," said the king, "let the sin offerings be offered for all Israel." He also appointed the Levites in the house of the ever-living, with cymbals, and lutes, and harps, as David and Gad the king's seer, with Nathan the preacher, had ordained. He ordained the same from the hand of the ever-living, by the medium of his preachers. So the Levites stood with the Davidian instruments, and the priests with trumpets, when Hezekiah commanded to offer the burnt offering on the altar, and as the offering began, they sang of the ever-living with trumpets, and by hand on the Davidian instruments of the king of Israel. Then all the senate bowed, and the singers sang, and the trumpets sounded, until the whole of the offerings were completed. And when the offering was completed, the king knelt, and his guests bowed with him, and Hezekiah the king and his nobles requested the Levites to praise the ever-living in the words of David and Asaph the seer. So they praised him gladly, and bowed themselves, and worshipped. Then Hezekiah spoke, and said, "Now you have filled your hand for the ever-living. Approach and bring sacrifices and thank offerings to the house of the Lord." So the assembly brought offerings, and all of a willing heart offered up. Consequently, the number of the offerings that the parliament brought were 70 bullocks, 100 rams, and 200 lambs, as a burnt offering to the ever-living for all of them. But the consecration was 600 bullocks and 3,000 sheep, so that the priests were too few, and were not able to strip the whole of the burnt offerings. Therefore their relatives, the Levites, had to help them until the completion of the work, and until the priests should consecrate themselves, for the Levites were more right-hearted to the consecration of themselves than the priests. And they also burnt the most of the fat of the thank offerings, and the drink offerings with the burnt offerings, and arranged the services of the ever-living's house. So Hezekiah and all the people were pleased at what God had provided for the people, for the affair was unexpected. Chapter 30. Hezekiah next sent to all Israel and Judea, and wrote a letter to Ephraim and Manasseh to invite them to the house of the ever-living at Jerusalem to make a Passover to the ever-living God of Israel. For the king and his nobles and all the parliament at Jerusalem had decided to make a Passover in the 2nd month, because they were not able to make it at its proper period. For the priests were not consecrated in sufficient numbers, and the people had not collected to Jerusalem. So the thing was right in the opinion of the king, and in the opinion of all the parliament. Consequently they fixed by a decree to send abroad a proclamation to all Israel from Beersheba to Dan, for them to come to make a Passover to the ever-living God of Israel at Jerusalem, for not many made it according to the Scriptures. Runners were therefore sent with letters from the hand of the king and the nobles of all Israel and Judea, as the king had commanded, to say to the children of Israel, "Return to the ever-living God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Israel, and he will return to the fugitive remnant of you from the hand of the kings of Ashur, and be not like your ancestors and your countrymen who have risen against the ever-living God of your fathers, who delivered them from the wasting you now see. Do not now stiffen yourselves like your fathers. Give your hand to God. Come and make yourselves holy, as he is holy forever, and serve your ever-living God, when he will turn his indignant anger from you. For when you turn to the ever-living, your brothers and children will find compassion before those who captured them, and will be returned to this land. For your ever-living God is gentle and merciful, and will not turn away from you, if you return to him." So the runners went from city to city in the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, and as far as Zebulun, but they were a subject of scorn and laughter for them, except that some persons from Manasseh and Zebulun obeyed and came to Jerusalem. In Judea, however, the hand of the ever-living was given to them, with one heart to act upon the order of the king and nobles in the affair of the ever-living. Consequently, a great many people collected at Jerusalem to keep the feast of unfermented bread in the 2nd month. A very great crowd, who rose up and overturned the pagan altars which were in Jerusalem, and overthrew all the incense altars and flung them into the Kidron brook, and slew the Passover on the 14th of the 2nd month. Then the priests and the Levites became ashamed, and consecrated themselves, and brought burnt offerings to the house of the ever-living, and stood at their duty as decreed in the laws of Moses the man of God, the priests sprinkling the blood from the hand of the Levites. For there were many in the parliament who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore the Levites conducted the killing of the Passovers, for all who were clean for the sanctuary of the Lord, because of the crowds of people, the crowds from Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar and Zebulun, who had purified themselves. Thus they ate the Passover, but not according to the records. But Hezekiah prayed for them, and said, "O ever-living, be kind, and expiate for it to every one whose heart is settled to seek for God, the ever-living God of our ancestors, although not according to the cleansings of the sanctuary." And the ever-living listened to Hezekiah, and accepted the people. So the children of Israel who were found in Jerusalem made the feast of unfermented bread for 7 days, with great gladness, the Levites and priests giving thanks to the ever-living day by day with powerful instruments unto the Lord, while Hezekiah spoke to the heart of every skillful Levite who showed good will for the ever-living. And the assembly ate for 7 days of the sacrifices of the altar, and thank offerings, and confessed to the ever-living God of their fathers. Then all the parliament decided to celebrate for 7 days after. So they made a festival of 7 days, when Hezekiah, king of Judah, gave up to the assembly 1,000 bullocks and 7,000 sheep. And the nobles gave to the assembly 1,000 bullocks and 10,000 sheep, and many priests consecrated themselves. Then all the parliament of Judah with priests and Levites rejoiced, with all the crowd who came from Israel, and the foreigners who came from the country of Israel, and the residents in Judea. So there was great festivity in Jerusalem. For from the days of Solomon ben David, king of Israel, there had never been like that in Jerusalem. Chapter 31. And when they had finished all this, all the Israelites who had been there went out to the towns of Judea, and smashed the columns, and cut up the lust booths, and overturned the mounds, and the altars, in all Judea, and Benjamin, and Ephraim, and Manasseh, totally. Then all the children of Israel returned, each to his own home and village. After that Hezekiah restored the courses of the priests and Levites, with the regulations for the work of each band of the priests and Levites, for the burnt offerings, and for the thank offerings, for ministrations, and for thanksgiving, and for praise at the gates of the Lord's camp. And the king gave from his own property the burnt offerings for the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice, for the Sabbaths, and for the months, and for the assemblies, as they were prescribed for in the laws of the ever-living. He also commanded the residents in Jerusalem, "Give gifts to the priests and Levites, because they instruct you in the laws of the ever-living." And when the order was promulgated, the children of Israel heaped up the firstfruits of corn, and wine, and oil, and honey, and all the produce of the land. Many also brought the tithes. The children of Israel and Judah, with the residents in the villages of Judea, also tithed the cattle and sheep, and dedicated the tithes to the sanctuary of their ever-living God, and brought and heaped them in heaps. They began in the 3rd month the collection, and completed it in the 7th month, when Hezekiah and the nobles went and examined the stacks, and thanked the ever-living and the people of Israel. Hezekiah then inquired of the priests and Levites about the stacks, when Azariah the priest, the head of the house of Zadok, answered him, and said, "From when the offerings began to come to the house of the ever-living, we have had enough food and plenty to spare, for the ever-living has blessed his people, and this great mass remains." Consequently Hezekiah ordered to store it in the chambers of the house of the ever-living. So they stored it, and brought in the offerings and tithes and gifts honestly, and appointed over them Conaniah the Levite, and Shimei his brother as his assistant, with Jechiel, and Azariah, and Asahel, and Jeremoth, and Josabad, and Elial, and Ismachiah, and Mathath, and Benhiah, officers under the hand of Conaniah, and Shimei his brother, whom Hezekiah the king appointed, and Azariah the governor of the house of God. But Korah ben Imnah the Levite, the doorkeeper on the east, was superintendent of the vows made to God, to distribute the offerings made to the ever-living, and the consecrated gifts, with Adon under his hand, and Meniamin, and Jeshua, and Shemaiah, and Arihu, and Shechaniah, in the cities of the priests, as trustees to distribute to their associates their shares, whether great or small, along with those on the genealogical records from the age of 3 years and upward, with all who entered the house of the ever-living, to serve from day to day in their services, and ministrations in their courses, with the genealogical priests by their ancestral houses, and the Levites from the age of 3 years and upwards in their trusts by their courses. And for the registration of all infants, wives, and sons, and daughters belonging to the whole aggregate, for it was entrusted to them as a sacred duty. And for the descendants of Aaron in the pasture lands of their cities, in all, city by city, men were appointed by name to pay to every male, and the salaries to the priests and to all the registered Levites. Hezekiah did this in all Judea, and acted well, and rightly, and truly before his ever-living God. For in every work that he began, in the services of the house of God, or in the law, or in the ordinances, he sought his God with all his heart in the work, and he prospered. Chapter 32. After these events, and his faithfulness, Sennacherib king of Ashur came and advanced against Judea, and encamped against the fortified cities, to clutch them for himself. But when Hezekiah saw how Sennacherib advanced to fight resolutely against Jerusalem, he consulted with his nobles and generals how to obstruct the waters from the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. So they collected many people and turned the springs aside, and the brook that wound through the country, reflecting, "Why should the king of Ashur come and find plenty of water?" They also strengthened and rebuilt the whole of the wall that had become dilapidated, and heightened the towers, and formed another outer wall, and repaired the fortress of the city of David, and made missiles and plenty of shields. He also placed military officers over the people, and collected them to himself in the square of the tower gate, and spoke to their hearts, and said, "Be bold and courageous, and fear not, nor be depressed at the face of the king of Ashur, or at the face of all the rabble who are with him. For there are more with us than with him. With him there is an arm of flesh. With us is our ever-living God to help and to fight our battles." And the people were pleased at the speech of Hezekiah, king of Judah. After that, Sennacherib the king of Ashur sent his minister to Jerusalem against Hezekiah, king of Judah, and all of Judea who were with him in Jerusalem. But himself with his commanders was at Lachish, and they said, "Thus asks Sennacherib king of Ashur, upon what do you rely that you remain in the fortress of Jerusalem? Let not Hezekiah seduce you to give you to death by famine and thirst, by saying, 'Our ever-living God will rescue you from the hands of the king of Ashur.' Is that not him whose mounds and altars Hezekiah has thrown down, and commanded to Judea and Jerusalem, saying, 'You shall worship at a single altar, and offer incense on it'? Do you not know what I and my fathers have done to all the peoples of the countries? Were the gods of the nations of the countries able to rescue their lands from my hand? Who among all these gods of the nations whom my ancestors desolated, who has been able to rescue them from my hand? So now let not Hezekiah deceive you nor seduce you like that, and do not trust to him. For none of all the gods of any nation or kingdom has been able to rescue his people from my hand or from the hand of my fathers, so that God of yours cannot rescue you from my hand." His officers declaimed still more against the ever-living God and against Hezekiah his servant. He also wrote letters to insult the living God of Israel, and said to him, "You are like the gods of the nations of the countries who could not rescue their peoples from my hand. So the God of Hezekiah cannot rescue his people from my hand." Then they shouted with a loud voice in Judith to the people of Jerusalem who were on the wall, to terrify and dispirit them, so that they might capture the city. They consequently spoke of the God of Jerusalem as of the gods of the peoples of the earth, made by the hands of men. But Hezekiah the king and Isaiah ben Amoz the preacher prayed about this, and cried to the heavens, and the ever-living sent his messenger and destroyed all the soldiers of the army, with its commander and generals, in the camp of the king of Ashur. So he returned disgraced back to his own country, and went to the house of his God, and the progeny of his own bowels caused him to fall there by the sword. Thus the ever-living saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib king of Ashur, and from the hand of all, and turned them back. Consequently many brought gifts to the ever-living at Jerusalem, with congratulations to Hezekiah king of Judea, and he was raised in the opinion of all the nations after that. At this period Hezekiah was ill, nearly to death, but he prayed to the ever-living, who answered him and performed a sign for him. But Hezekiah did not repay to him in return, for his heart was proud. Therefore anger came upon himself, and Judea, and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah lowered the pride of his heart, and the people of Jerusalem with him, so that the anger of the ever-living did not come upon them in the days of Hezekiah. Then Hezekiah became rich and very greatly honored, so he made himself treasuries for the silver and gold and precious stones, and for the spices and the shields, and all his costly furniture, and barns to collect corn, and wine, and oil, and yards for all kinds of cattle and flocks for the yards. He also made villages for himself, and acquired sheep and oxen in abundance, for God gave him very great prosperity. It was Hezekiah also who turned the upper waters of the Gihon, and conducted them to a bed on the west of the city of David, for Hezekiah succeeded in all that he did. But, however, in the affair of the scientific inquirers who were sent to him from Babel to inquire about the remarkable event which had happened to the earth, God left him to test him and know all his heart. But the rest of the doings of Hezekiah and his piety, they can be seen written in the visions of Isaiah ben Amoz the preacher, in the history of the kings of Judah and Israel. Then Hezekiah slept with his fathers, and they buried him on the top of the tombs of the descendants of David, and made a mourning for him. After his death all Judea and the inhabitants of Jerusalem elected Manasseh his son king in his stead. Chapter 33. Manasseh was 12 years old at his coronation, and reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. But he did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living, like the abominable heathen, whom the ever-living had driven out from before the children of Israel, and went and rebuilt the mounds that Hezekiah his father had overturned, and raised altars to Baalim, and made lust booths, and bowed to all the host of the skies, and served them. He also built altars in the house of the Lord, where the ever-living had said to Jerusalem, his name should be forever. Yes, he built altars to all the host of the skies, in the second court of the house of the ever-living. He himself also passed his children to the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and to clouds, and snakes, and incantations, and practiced necromancy with ventriloquists, and did much evil in the sight of the ever-living, to provoke him. He also placed an image of the imagination which he had formed in the house of God, of which God had said to David and Solomon his son, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, to fix my name forever, and I will not again turn the foot of Israel off from the ground that I appointed for their fathers, if only they will practice all that I directed them, and all my laws and institutions and decrees by the hand of Moses." Yet Manasseh seduced Judea and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to practice depravity more than the heathen whom the ever-living wasted before the face of the children of Israel. The ever-living, however, spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they would not listen. Consequently, the ever-living brought upon them the generals of the army of the kings of Ashur, who took Manasseh with hooks, and chained him in chains, and transferred him to Babel, when in his distress he appeased the anger of the ever-living God, and humbled himself very greatly before the God of his fathers, and prayed to him, who pitied and listened to his supplication, and restored him to Jerusalem to his kingship. Then Manasseh acknowledged that the ever-living was God. After that he built an outer wall to the city of David alongside of the brook Gihon, and extending to the fish gate, and around the hill, and it was very high. He also placed military officers in all the fortified cities of Judea, and threw out the foreign gods, and the image from the house of the ever-living, and all the altars he had built on the hill of the Lord's house, and in Jerusalem, and flung them out of the city. Then he rebuilt the altar of the ever-living, and sacrificed upon it thank offerings, and confessed, and promised to the ever-living to serve the living God of Israel. However, the people still sacrificed at the mounds, but only to the ever-living God. But the other acts of Manasseh, and his prayer to his God, and the speeches of the seers who addressed him in the name of the living God of Israel, can be seen in the histories of the kings of Israel, with his prayer, and the pity shown him, with all his sins and wickedness, and the places in which he built mounds, and set up lust booths and idols before he repented, can be read as recorded in the books of the seers. At last Manasseh slept with his fathers, and they buried him in his own palace, and Amon his son reigned in his place. Amon was 22 years old at his coronation, and reigned 2 years in Jerusalem, and did evil in the sight of the ever-living, as Manasseh his father had done, and to all the idols that his father had made Amon sacrificed and served. And he never repented before the ever-living as his father Manasseh repented, but Amon himself offended more. His ministers consequently conspired against him, and killed him in his own palace. But the people of the country assailed all the conspirators against King Amon. Then the country people elected Joash his son king in his place. Chapter 34. Josiah was 8 years old at his coronation, and reigned 31 years in Jerusalem, and did right in the eyes of the ever-living, and walked in the ways of his ancestor David, and turned not to the right or the left. But in the 8th year of his reign, while he was yet a youth, he began to seek the God of his ancestor David, and in the 12th year began to cleanse Judea and Jerusalem from the mounds and lust booths and images and castings. He had the altars to the Baalim smashed in his own presence, and cut down the images of the sun that were elevated over them, and ground to powder the lusts and idols and castings, and scattered the dust on the surface of the graves of the sacrificers to them. He also burnt the bones of the priests on their altars. Thus he cleansed Judea and Jerusalem with the cities of Manasseh and Ephraim and Simeon, and as far as Naphtali. He destroyed them all round, when he broke the altars and the lusts and images, and reduced them to powder, and cut down all the images of the sun in the land of Israel. Then he returned to Jerusalem. Thus in the 18th year of his reign, when he had cleansed the country and the temple, he ordered Shaphan ben Azaliah, and Shemaiah, governor of the city, and Joach ben Joachaz, the recorder, to repair the temple of the ever-living. So they went to Hilkiah the high priest, and delivered the money to repair the house of God, which the Levites who guarded the threshold had collected from the hands of Manasseh and Ephraim, and from all the remnant of Israel, and from all Judea and Benjamin, and which they had brought to Jerusalem. And he paid it into the hands of the superintendents who did the work at the house of the ever-living. And they paid it to the workmen who worked in the Lord's house to mend and repair the temple. They also paid it to the carpenters and masons, and bought stone from the cutters, and timber for girders and rafters, for the houses that the kings of Judah had destroyed. And the men did their work faithfully, and the directors over them were Jacoth and Abdihu, Levites from the Beni Merari, and Zechariah and Meshullam from the Beni Kaf, to superintend, and Levites who all understood carpentry work. They superintended the laborers, and directed all the work done, in one sort or the other, but the accountants and architects and valuers were from the Levites. Once when they were drawing money from the treasury of the house of the ever-living, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the ever-living's laws in the handwriting of Moses. So Hilkiah the priest spoke to Shaphan the secretary, and said, "I have found the book of the law in the house of the ever-living." And Hilkiah handed the book to Shaphan. Thus Shaphan took the book to the king, and reported to the king, saying, "All that you committed to the hands of your servants has been done, for they have removed the money found in the house of the ever-living, and given it to the custody of the superintendents, and to the hands of those working in the business." Shaphan the secretary further informed the king, saying, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." Then Shaphan read from it to the king, but when the king heard the words of the law, he tore his robes. Then the king commanded Hilkiah, and Achikam ben Shaphan, and Abdon ben Micah, and Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's servant, to go and inquire of the ever-living about me, and about the remnant in Israel and in Judea regarding the book that has been found, for a great anger of the Lord may be poured on us, because our ancestors have not regarded the commands of the ever-living, to practice all that is written in this book. So Hilkiah and the king's messengers went to Huldah the preacheress, the wife of Shallum ben Thokath ben Kashra, keeper of the wardrobe, who resided in Jerusalem in the seminary, and asked her about it, when she replied to them, "Thus says the ever-living God of Israel, say to the man who sent you to me, Thus says the ever-living, I will bring evil on this place and on its inhabitants. The whole of the curses written in the book that you read before the king of Judah, because you forsook me and burnt incense to seducing gods, by which they provoked me in every act of their hand. Therefore I will pour my indignation on this place, and it will not be extinguished. But to the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of the ever-living, say thus to him, Thus says the ever-living God of Israel about the things you have heard. Because your heart is impressionable, and you were humble before God when you heard his words against this place, and against its inhabitants, and humbled yourself before me, and tore your robes, and wept before me, I also have listened, says the ever-living. Therefore I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be added to your tomb in peace, and your eyes shall not see all the misery that I will bring on this place and on its inhabitants. So they related this message to the king. The king consequently sent and collected all the magistracy of Judea to Jerusalem, when the king ascended to the house of the ever-living, and all the parliament of Judea with him, and the people of Jerusalem, with the priests and Levites, and all the public, from the greatest to the least, and read in their hearing all the contents of the book of laws which had been found in the Lord's house. After that the king stood up on his platform, and made an agreement before the ever-living to walk after the Lord, and to keep his commands, and evidences, and institutions with all his heart and all his mind, and to practice the realities of the covenant written in that book. He then stationed all who were present in Jerusalem and in Benjamin, and they with the inhabitants of Jerusalem made the same promise to God, the God of their fathers. So Josiah expelled all the abominations from the whole country that belonged to the children of Israel, and compelled all resident in Israel to serve. Yes, to serve the ever-living God. They did not turn from the following the living God of their fathers all his days. Chapter 35. Josiah afterwards made a Passover to the ever-living in Jerusalem, and slew the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, when he appointed the priests in their duties, and exhorted them to the services of the house of the ever-living, and commanded the Levites to instruct all Israel about their duties to the Lord, and to take the holy ark to the apartment that Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, had built. Let it no more be borne on your shoulders. Serve your ever-living God now with the people of Israel, and arrange yourselves by your ancestral houses, according to your divisions, as recorded by David king of Israel, and by the records of his son Solomon, and attend to your duty by sections of ancestral houses, with your brothers, the sons of the people, and the divisions of the ancestral houses of the Levites. So kill the Passover, and consecrate yourselves, and unite with your brothers to practice the command of the ever-living, sent by the hand of Moses. Josiah then gave to the children of his people lambs from the sheep, and young goats for the Passover to all present, to the number of 30,000 and 3,000 oxen. These were the private property of the king. And his ministers gave of free will to the people, the priests, and the Levites, Hilkiah and Zechariah and Jechiel, the leaders of the house of God. They gave to the priests for their Passover 2,600 lambs and 300 oxen. Conaniah and Shemaiah and Nathanal his brother, and Cashabiah and Javal and Jozabad, nobles of the Levites, gave to the Levites for their Passover 5,000 lambs and 500 oxen. Thus the service was prepared, and the priests appointed, and the Levites in their divisions, according to the order of the king, and they killed the Passover. Then the priests sprinkled from their hands, and the Levites stripped and removed the burnt offering that had to be presented by the sections of ancestral houses of the children of the people, and approached the ever-living as prescribed in the book of Moses, and the same with the oxen. They then roasted the Passover with fire as decreed, and boiled the consecrations in boilers and cauldrons and pans, and distributed to all the children of the people. And afterwards prepared for themselves and for the priests, because the priests, the descendants of Aaron, were offering burnt offerings from the dawn until night. So the Levites prepared for themselves and for the descendants of Aaron. The singers also, the descendants of Asaph, and Heman, and Jeduthun the royal seer, and the doorkeepers from gate to gate, who could not themselves go away from their duty, like their brothers, the Levites prepared for them. They also prepared for all the services of the ever-living on that day, in making the Passover, and offering the burnt offerings upon the altar of the Lord, as King Josiah commanded. Thus the children of Israel who were present at that time made the Passover and the feast of unfermented bread for 7 days. No Passover like this was made in Israel from the days of Samuel the preacher by all the kings of Israel. They did not make a Passover such as Josiah made, with the priests and Levites, and all Judah and Israel present, with the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Josiah made this Passover in the 18th year of his reign. After all this, when Josiah had repaired the temple, Necho king of the Mizraim came up to attack Carchemish on the Phrath, but Josiah went out to oppose him. When he sent messengers to ask, "What is there between you and I, king of Judah? I have not prepared today against you, but against the house I am at war with, and God commanded me to make haste. Restrain yourself from opposing God, who is with me, and he will not destroy you." Josiah, however, would not turn from opposing him, but determined to fight, and would not listen to the statements of Necho from the mouth of the ever-living, but went to battle with him on the plain of Megiddo, where the archers shot King Josiah. So the king said to his servants, "Take me to the rear, for I am badly wounded." His servants consequently took him to the rear from amongst the chariots, and placed him on another chariot he had, and they carried him to Jerusalem, where he died, and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. But all Judea and Jerusalem mourned over Josiah. Jeremiah also lamented over Josiah, and all the men and women singers speak in their laments of Josiah to this day, and they are remembered in Israel, and can be seen written in the elegies. For the rest of the events of Josiah, and his piety in accordance to the written laws of the ever-living, and his speeches, the first and the last, are recorded in the records of the kings of Israel and Judah. Chapter 36. Then the people of the country took Jehoahaz ben Josiah, and crowned him in his father's stead at Jerusalem. Jehoahaz was 23 years of age at his coronation, and reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. For the king of the Mizraim expelled him from Jerusalem, and fined the country 100 talents of silver, and a talent of gold. The king of the Mizraim also made Eliakim king over Judea and Jerusalem, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. Then Necho took Jehoahaz his brother, and sent him to the Mizraim. Jehoiakim was 25 years old at his coronation, and reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, but did evil in the eyes of the ever-living God. And Nebuchadnezzar king of Babel advanced against him, and bound him in chains, and carried him to Babel. The rest of the doings of Jehoiakim, and the depravities he committed, and were habitual with him, are written in the records of the kings of Israel and Judah. But Jehoiakim his son reigned after. Jehoiakim was 18 years old at his coronation, and reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem, and did wrong in the sight of the ever-living. But at the turn of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar sent and had him brought to Babel, with the precious vessels of the house of the Lord, and made Zechariah his brother king over Judea and Jerusalem. Zechariah was 21 years of age at his coronation, and reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. But he did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living God. He did not submit and repent at the words of Jeremiah the preacher from the mouth of the ever-living. And also he revolted from Nebuchadnezzar, to whom he had sworn obedience by God, and stiffened his neck, and encouraged his heart against turning to the ever-living God of Israel. All the nobles also, the priests and the people, heaped crime upon crime with all the depravities of the heathen, and defiled the house of the Lord, which had been consecrated in Jerusalem. Although the ever-living God of their fathers sent to them by the hand of his messengers, diligently sending, because he was grieved for his people and for their sons. But they jeered at the messengers of God, and despised his messages, and were disgusted at his preachers, until the indignation of the Lord arose against his people without remedy, and he brought up against them the king of the Kasdim, who slaughtered their choice young men in the consecrated house, and had no pity over boy or girl, old man or gray-haired. He gave all to his power. And all the vessels of the house of God, great or small, and the treasures of the house of the ever-living, and the treasures of the king and his nobles, he carried the whole to Babel. Then he burnt the house of God, and threw down the walls of Jerusalem, and burnt all the palaces with fire, and destroyed all their costly furniture, and transported to Babel the remnants from the sword, and they became slaves to him and his children, until the empire of the king of Persia, and accomplished the message from the ever-living by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. For all the time it was waste, it rested for a complete 70 years. But in the first year of Koresh, king of Persia, was completed the promise of the ever-living by the mouth of Jeremiah. And the ever-living aroused the spirit of Koresh, king of Persia, and he passed a proclamation to all his empire, and also recorded it in writing, to command, "Thus says Koresh, king of Persia, to all the kingdoms of the earth, the ever-living God of the heathens gave to me the whole empire of the earth. He has also appointed me to build him a temple in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Whoever of his people is with you, the Lord God is with him. Let him go up." The end of the second book of the Chronicles, and the end of the Old Testament of the Holy Bible in modern English, translated by Farrar Fenton. Recording by Mark Penfold. Completed February 8th, 2017, Lincoln, Nebraska.